At first, they ran from the police. Then they ran from prisons. Then they ran from the country itself. Every escape made them feel smarter. Every kill made surrender impossible. By 1934, Bonnie and Clyde weren't fugitives anymore. They were a problem the system had decided to end. And once that decision is made, there is no arrest waiting at the end. Before dawn on May 23, 1934, the highway outside Sales, in Bienville Parish, Louisiana, appeared like any rural road, bordered by ditches and uneven brush. Officers from Louisiana and Texas waited, concealed, their faces set for violence after months of pursuit. They knew that Bonnie and Clyde had killed lawmen, stolen cars, and learned to escape faster than paperwork could catch them. The ambush began with the gap between local authority and federal jurisdiction. As Bonnie and Clyde's crimes were still considered local offenses, early law enforcement attempts failed, and their notoriety grew through constant movement, evading roadblocks, and leaving behind violence that fueled the public's perception of the duo as a national crisis. The Bureau of Investigation's involvement began with the discovery of a stolen Ford that crossed state lines. In September 1932, a Ford stolen in Pawhuska, Oklahoma, was found in Michigan, signaling interstate movement. The discovery of a prescription bottle tied to Clyde Barrow's aunt led investigators to track the Barrows' movements, providing concrete proof of their crimes and names tied to the stolen cars. The investigation gathered strength with the discovery that Clyde, Bonnie and Clyde's brother LC, had visited the aunt and driven the stolen Ford. The prescription bottle connected them further, creating a trail of proximity and intent. This led to a federal warrant in May 1933, allowing the FBI to distribute notices with fingerprints, photographs, and criminal records, allowing a larger system to track the fugitives. Bonnie and Clyde's crime spree began in January 1930 when they met in Texas. Bonnie married to an imprisoned man, and Clyde, a repeat offender, bonded over shared hardship. Clyde escaped prison once with Bonnie's help, but upon release in 1932, resumed crime immediately. Their life on the run, living out of cars and motels, became their survival strategy. As 1932 turned into 1933, the Barrow Gang formed and reformed, expanding to include Raymond Hamilton, then W.D. Jones, and finally Clyde's brother Buck, who brought his wife Blanche. The gang's volatile nature led to violent confrontations, multiple escapes, and a well-organized group, learning from each robbery which roads were less guarded, and how to avoid capture. The summer of 1933 began to fracture the gang. In late July, during a shootout in Iowa, Buck Barrow was fatally wounded, and Blanche was captured, showing the inevitability of loss in their life of flight. The gang had survived by moving and firing first, but firefights often ended with someone bleeding out, and Buck didn't survive. In November 1933, W.D. Jones was captured, leaving Bonnie and Clyde as a pair again. Law enforcement pressure didn't ease. They escaped a trap near Grand Prairie, Texas, on November 22, 1933, and continued their violent spree, robbing a citizen in Shreveport in December, tightening the Louisiana connection that would shape the end of the chase. January 1934 escalated the pursuit into an all-out campaign. On January 16th, Clyde and Bonnie freed prisoners from Eastham State Prison Farm, including Raymond Hamilton. Clyde covered the retreat with machine gun fire as the escapees ran. The breakout forced law enforcement to treat the gang as a major threat. Among the escapees was Henry Methvin, who would soon become central to the final months. The breakout inflamed public anger and hardened the men pursuing them. It also showed that Clyde was willing to strike directly at institutions, not just rob but also free people publicly. By spring 1934, Bonnie and Clyde's movements were marked by escalating violence, with every encounter potentially deadly. On April 1, 1934, they shot 2 highway patrolmen in Texas. On April 6th, a constable was mortally wounded in Miami, Oklahoma. Abductions and assaults added to the unpredictability. The Bureau, still anchored in the interstate car theft charge, followed every clue across states, distributing updated notices and identifying patterns. They discovered connections to Henry Methvin's family in Louisiana and confirmed Bonnie and Clyde had been driving a car stolen in New Orleans, an indicator of where they felt safe. On April 13, 1934, an FBI agent obtained information placing Bonnie and Clyde in a remote section of Louisiana, where they had visited the Methvin home. Law enforcement realized they had been moving between Texas and Louisiana, sometimes accompanied by Methvin. This narrowed the search, making it a matter of anticipating their return rather than a broad pursuit. FBI agents and local authorities focused on that area, learning Bonnie and Clyde, with some Methvins, had staged a gathering at Black Lake, Louisiana, on May 21, 1934, and were expected to return 2 days later, This precise information gave the pursuers a credible reason to wait instead of chase. On May 23, the men in the bushes near Sales waited for the Ford to appear. This was not a checkpoint, or a show of authority, but a decision shaped by months of lessons learned. They understood that hesitation or negotiation would result in gunfire and dead officers, positioned to end the chase in seconds. Their plan was built around the road, and the belief that Bonnie and Clyde would drive into the kill zone when the light was right. But the road's still empty. They listened for the engine, watched for dust, and held their weapons, knowing the only outcomes were escape or death. As early daylight strengthened, a car appeared, and the officers recognized it. The next moments were the culmination of the Bureau's evidence trail, the interstate warrant, and the captures that stripped away gang members. When the car attempted to flee, officers opened fire. The ambush ended the manhunt with overwhelming force. Bonnie and Clyde were killed instantly, and their car became a wrecked, bullet-riddled symbol of the violence that had followed them. The scene drew attention and crowds, and the chase was over. But the story was just beginning to turn into legend. In January 1930, Dallas faced economic hardship. Neighborhoods were marked by scarcity, and families made daily decisions about rent, food, and work. In this environment, Bonnie Parker, 19, and Clyde Barrow, 21, met. Bonnie, tied to a marriage with an imprisoned husband, had her future narrowed by poverty. Clyde, already familiar with law enforcement, lived a life of petty theft, burglaries, and car thefts, made sharper by the Depression. Their bond formed in a world where consequences came quickly, and long-term planning was a luxury. This connection was crucial, as it endured through incarceration, pursuit, and a life on the run. Clyde's trajectory tightened after his arrest for burglary, bringing him back into the cycle of crime and punishment. Jail did not reform him, it hardened him, exposing him to older criminals and humiliation. Bonnie smuggled a gun to him, signaling her deep loyalty. Their escape was brief but violent, triggering immediate recapture. The authorities, embarrassed, responded by tightening their grip. Clyde's reputation grew, and the violence introduced into their pattern would only make future encounters with law enforcement more dangerous. When Clyde returned to prison, the separation didn't end his connection with Bonnie. It took on a new shape, defined by visits, letters, and months of waiting, while the world outside collapsed under economic pressure. Bonnie's life in the early 1930s was not glamorous. It was tight, constrained, and ordinary. For Clyde, prison fueled resentment and deepened his sense that normal life was unattainable. By the time his parole approached, he had internalized the idea that freedom would mean returning to criminal activity, not lawful life. In February 1932, Clyde was paroled. The release wasn't a clean break, but a temporary opening into a world with few legitimate options. He quickly rejoined Bonnie, and the partnership resumed with urgency. Parole didn't bring stability but pressure. As Clyde was now under supervision, rather than retreating to quiet labor, he resumed crime, starting with thefts, burglaries, and stealing cars. For them, stolen cars were not just transportation. They were shelter and escape routes, essential to survival. Movement became their primary method of survival, with each stolen car providing a quick getaway. As 1932 progressed, their pattern tightened. They began moving across broader areas, committing crimes in quick strikes, leaving before law enforcement could respond. Their notoriety was rising, marked by stolen cars crossing jurisdictions and occasional confrontations with lawmen. Their crimes were not isolated, but part of a growing routine based on speed, opportunism, and escalating violence. Each successful escape reinforced the idea that law enforcement was always a step behind. Their reliance on weapons and close calls made them an increasingly coordinated unit, constantly evaluating risks and contacts. The early phase of Bonnie and Clyde's renewed criminal life quickly drew others into their orbit. Criminal activity on the road created temporary alliances, drivers, gunmen, and friends offering food and shelter, though their gang would later formalize. The beginning was more fluid, with associates coming and going based on fear, loyalty, or profit. Clyde's family connections provided temporary hideouts, but also increased risks. Associates became targets, with relatives and friends questioned or arrested, tightening the system around the fugitives. Law enforcement didn't need immediate capture. It only needed to identify those who facilitated their movement. By late 1932, stolen automobiles crossing state lines created evidence that eventually drew federal attention. Abandoned cars left jurisdictional fingerprints, forcing police departments to communicate. While Bonnie and Clyde used vehicle theft to escape, it also left a trail. They didn't know which detail would become decisive, but their lifestyle generated investigative material. Stolen cars, gas purchases, and sightings all contributed to a growing investigative trail. Even fragmented law enforcement could turn these traces into leads. By the end of this phase, their story had not yet reached national obsession, but the direction was set. Clyde was out of prison, Bonnie at his side, and their actions after February 1932 pointed toward escalation. They had a strategy based on motion and stolen cars, confident that speed and surprise could outpace coordination. Local lawmen were accumulating files, building connections between crimes in different places. The country, struggling with unemployment and desperation, provided a landscape where fugitives could blend in. The chase was forming. A young couple, a parole that led back into crime, a road that offered escape while generating evidence, and law enforcement beginning to realize the chase would span beyond one county. The next stage would be marked by more companions, robberies and violence, making the pursuit a national priority. By late 1932, the pattern of theft, flight, and abandonment that Bonnie and Clyde had built began to generate evidence. Investigators could assemble. Every stolen automobile crossing state lines became part of a growing web of police reports. These fragmented records began to form a pattern of similar car makes, theft methods, and recoveries that crossed jurisdictions. In autumn, one case began to stand out due to its wide travel. In September 1932, a Ford stolen from Powesca, Oklahoma, was found in Jackson, Michigan. The car had crossed too many jurisdictions, requiring an agency capable of working across state lines. The Bureau was not yet sure who was driving it, but the distance implied organization. At Powesca, another Ford, stolen from Illinois, was found. 2 cars, 2 thefts. This repetitive pattern began to look deliberate. Inside one of the abandoned vehicles, officers found a prescription bottle from a pharmacy in Nacogdoches, Texas. It seemed ordinary, but could be traced. The prescription had been filled for Clyde Barrow's aunt. This was the Bureau's first tangible link between the stolen cars and known individuals. It didn't prove violence, but it suggested that the same people who had been seen in Texas were leaving traces further north. Agents traced the prescription's possession, discovering that Clyde, Bonnie, and Clyde's brother L.C. Barrow had recently visited the woman who had obtained it. The car they were using matched the stolen Ford's description. The prescription bottle had been handed down by L.C. Barrow to the woman's son. Law enforcement now saw these as connected acts, not isolated incidents. Names and faces were now attached to the case. Before the Bureau's involvement, law enforcement was scattered. Sheriffs responded to robberies. Deputies investigated abandoned cars, and local officers questioned witnesses who rarely identified the pair. The Bureau gave the case continuity and jurisdiction, as the crime of interstate transportation of stolen property fell under federal authority. What had been fragmented local concerns became a coordinated federal pursuit, with fingerprints, photographs, and criminal records building the official case. On May 20th, 1933, a warrant was issued against Clyde and Bonnie for interstate transportation of a stolen automobile. This allowed the Bureau to shift from observation to active pursuit. Wanted notices were distributed, with descriptions emphasizing Clyde's wiry build and Bonnie's smaller size. These notices corrected the misconception that Bonnie was merely a bystander, marking her equally culpable. The Bureau's involvement changed the tempo of law enforcement efforts. Reports began to flow into regional offices, which noticed a pattern in the fugitives' movements: sudden appearances in one state, disappearances into another, abandoned cars, and witnesses describing the same couple with different license plates. Investigators began specifically looking for stolen Fords, which became a recurring marker of the Barrow Trail. In the months following the warrant, the Bureau's files filled with reports from agents and local police chiefs about abandoned cars, spent casings from firefights and robberies. Clyde and Bonnie traveled quickly but followed a consistent pattern of using rural roads to avoid patrols and reach state borders. They changed cars often, stayed in inexpensive motels, and moved at night. Agents learned to anticipate their movements, knowing they would remain one step ahead unless something mechanical failed or a contact betrayed them. The prescription bottle that started the federal investigation became a symbol within the Bureau, showing how small evidence could alter a case. It revealed that even skilled fugitives left traces, purchases, prescriptions, and casual mentions. By mid-1933, the Bureau's pursuit had become structured, with stolen cars crossing state lines strengthening the government's legal claim to continue the hunt. The agents built a case, even if it might never be presented in court, as the paperwork itself represented control. Meanwhile, Bonnie and Clyde focused on survival: fuel, rest, new cars, and staying ahead of the reports now labeling them as public enemies. They changed license plates and took back roads through Texas, Oklahoma, and Missouri. Unaware that every stolen Ford added to the Bureau's growing case, they believed each vehicle switch severed a link, not realizing that the serial numbers helped build the evidence against them. The Bureau's internal communications shifted from uncertainty to precision. Early reports were vague, but by late 1933, they referenced specific names, connections to the Barrow family, and known associates. The agents compiled a detailed dossier on everyone linked to Bonnie and Clyde. The investigation became an archive in motion, with diagrams of probable routes and lists of connected car thefts. Public awareness grew as the Bureau's internal precision increased. Photographs of Bonnie and Clyde with weapons, recovered from a Joplin hideout, became a national sensation. While these images fueled the myth of glamour, they helped the Bureau distribute accurate descriptions. The case, which began with a prescription bottle and a stolen Ford, had grown into one of the largest multi-state manhunts of its time. By early 1934, the Bureau's pursuit had reached both depth and reach. The case files contained hundreds of pages, maps, and summaries of every violent incident attributed to the pair. Agents knew that cornering Bonnie and Clyde led to dead officers and empty roads. The strategy shifted to intelligence, using informants, tracking vehicle registrations, and coordinating with state police. Every car theft was logged, and abandoned Fords were examined for clues, turning the chase into an organized campaign. The Ford trail became both a literal and symbolic path, connecting stolen cars as the couple's lifeline and the Bureau's map. The prescription bottle served as the proof that federalized the pursuit, and the warrant unified scattered manhunts into one coordinated mission. By May 1934, the Bureau had built a strong case, and the pursuit's end was inevitable. The road ahead, measured in miles or days, led directly to Louisiana, where the chase would end. After Clyde's parole in February 1932, his and Bonnie's lives no longer allowed time to rebuild a lawful routine. They focused on quick money, fast movement, and avoiding detection. Their crimes were not dramatic, but a steady sequence of burglaries, robberies, and car thefts that allowed them to keep moving. They targeted small businesses, rural stops, and isolated victims, because large bank jobs drew too much attention. Every car theft not only provided transportation, but severed the link between their last sighting and the next, with the stolen car left abandoned and replaced quickly. By late 1932, their pattern drew in associates, forming a group marked by instability and the dangerous combination of youth, weapons, and fear. Raymond Hamilton joined the group in 1932, shifting them from a pair to a more dangerous moving unit. With Hamilton, the gang's encounters with law enforcement became more lethal. A group with armed men could quickly decide to fight their way out, rather than hesitate. The gang's movement forced local law enforcement to confront a problem beyond their jurisdiction, as they crossed borders overnight, abandoned cars routinely, and used rural roads to vanish. Yet, the more they moved, the more evidence they left behind. Abandoned vehicles, witness descriptions, tire tracks, and mistakes made under constant pressure. By November 1932, the gang's composition shifted again when William Daniel Jones replaced Hamilton. Jones, drawn into a life of constant running, increased the gang's operational capacity, but also its vulnerability. Every new member meant more chances for panic and betrayal. The group moved recklessly, believing that repeated escapes meant luck was on their side. They carried firearms routinely and stayed in small motels or rural homes, always on the move. Local law enforcement knew their description, but struggled to catch them. The fugitives' real advantage was their speed. They could cross into another state before officers even decided which agency should take responsibility. In spring 1933, the gang expanded further with Clyde's brother, Ivan "Buck" Barrow, who was released from prison on March 23, 1933. Buck's addition, with his wife Blanche, turned the group into 5 members. The presence of family loyalty intensified the recklessness, pushing decisions toward confrontation rather than retreat. Blanche's involvement exposed her to dangers beyond her control. The group's robberies grew bolder, and press coverage expanded. Law enforcement realized this was no longer just about theft. Every encounter now carried the potential for gunfire, as the gang treated any interruption as a direct threat to their survival. In April 1933, the gang's stay in Joplin, Missouri, ended in violence when local officers attempted to approach their residence. What began as a routine disturbance call quickly escalated into gunfire, resulting in the deaths of 2 officers. This event not only marked a significant shift in the Barrow saga, but also fueled their notoriety. Fleeing the scene, the gang left behind photographs and personal items that turned them into nationally recognized figures. The photographs recovered from the Joplin hideout showed Bonnie and Clyde posing with firearms, fueling a myth of fearless outlaws. These images spread through newspapers, creating a visual narrative that simplified their story into one of defiance. For law enforcement, the photos were identification tools, highlighting their growing confidence. The images also turned Bonnie and Clyde into recognizable criminals, intensifying both the danger to officers and the pressure to end the chase. After Joplin, the gang's flight intensified. The killing of officers meant every law enforcement agency now treated them as dangerous criminals to be met with force. Roadblocks became more aggressive, and officers were instructed to shoot, if necessary. The gang adjusted by prioritizing speed, using rural routes to avoid detection. Every stolen car left behind provided temporary relief, but also left traces for investigators to follow. The chase became both kinetic and bureaucratic, high-speed chases and paperwork trying to link incidents. By mid-1933, the gang experienced a violent car crash near Wellington, Texas, leaving Bonnie severely injured. The injury limited her mobility, but did not stop their flight. They adapted their routines around her condition, continuing to use stolen cars and remote hideouts to stay ahead of law enforcement. Even serious injury didn't translate to surrender, as they knew capture meant prison or death. The manhunt began shifting from scattered pursuit to a more coordinated strategy. The Bureau's interest grew through evidence of stolen cars and interstate movement. While local agencies focused on the Barrow family and associates, criminals on the run often returned to familiar people for support, and the gang's movements began to follow familiar routes, providing law enforcement with patterns to study. By the end of this phase, the Barrow group had evolved from a pair of fugitives to a small gang with a public identity and a bloody trail. The killings in Joplin and the photographs spread their faces across the country, while the crash near Wellington revealed the physical toll of their flight. Buck and Blanche's addition added loyalty and vulnerability, and every stolen car and rapid crossing of state lines expanded the case. This marked the transition to federal jurisdiction, turning the chase into a national operation that would soon have the Bureau's official entry. By summer 1933, the name Barrow had spread across sheriff offices in Texas, Oklahoma, and Missouri. Officers saw the gang as both an opportunity and a danger. Catching them promised recognition, but most officers who tried didn't live long enough to enjoy it. The files grew thicker with reports of robberies, kidnappings, assaults, and abandoned Fords. When the Bureau of Investigation received the warrant on May 20th, 1933, the pursuit shifted from scattered ambition to an organized campaign. The Bureau's first task was procedural, distributing identification orders with fingerprints, photographs, and known aliases. Communication was slow but ensured even small departments could identify the fugitives. The notices made Bonnie and Clyde federal criminals, not just local thieves. The Bureau's efforts reached even the smallest jurisdictions. Local constables now knew that the fugitives had triggered attention in Washington. Agents worked with sheriffs and detectives, teaching them how to share information. A map emerged, showing the fugitives' path from Texas to Oklahoma, to Missouri, and back south. To agents, it was migration. To the fugitives, it was survival. Meanwhile, Bonnie and Clyde continued moving, with Buck and Blanche recovering from Joplin, while maintaining a semblance of normal life. Bonnie, still recovering from her injuries, traveled in pain while Clyde drove, ever vigilant. They stopped only when exhaustion forced them. Nights were spent in motels or relatives' homes, avoiding questions. By mid-1933, the gang shifted to robbing small-town banks. These quick, low-risk robberies kept them supplied for travel. Each successful escape reinforced their belief that speed and daring could defeat law enforcement. The press amplified their image, depicting Bonnie as either a gun-toting accomplice or a captive of Clyde. But either version expanded their notoriety. The law's response hardened. The Bureau began to notice patterns: the make of car, direction of flight, and ammunition type. Clyde favored .45 caliber pistols and military-grade weapons, while his preference for Ford V8s became a consistent lead. Agents checked reports of stolen Fords, which became a backbone of the case, linking crimes without visible connections. By late July 1933, reports placed the gang in Iowa, near Dexfield Park. On July 29th, officers closed in on a suspected hideout, but the encounter escalated quickly. Gunfire erupted, and Buck was mortally wounded, while Blanche was captured. Clyde, Bonnie, and W.D. Jones escaped. Buck's death marked the end of the gang as a cohesive unit. It was now just Clyde and Bonnie against the world. After the Iowa shootout, law enforcement treated the fugitives as targets to be eliminated. The Bureau circulated an updated order, listing the known deaths attributed to them. Public anger mounted, and state patrols, federal agents, and local deputies formed a reluctant alliance. In November 1933, W.D. Jones was captured, leaving Bonnie and Clyde isolated. They increasingly relied on stolen cars and a few remaining contacts. With every night spent listening for approaching engines and every knock on a door, their notoriety made them instantly recognizable, but offered no safety. Law enforcement pressure peaked as winter approached. In late November, a botched ambush near Grand Prairie, Texas, failed to catch the fugitives. The officers opened fire too early, missing them as they escaped in another stolen car. The failed ambush only intensified the determination to end the chase. In December 1933, the gang resurfaced in Louisiana. They robbed a citizen in Shreveport, then disappeared into the backroads. Investigators realized Louisiana offered the fugitives familiarity and friendly connections. The Methvin family, involved in the upcoming Eastham breakout, would soon play a key role in their downfall. Through the end of 1933, the Bureau coordinated roadblocks and tracked Clyde's movements, but his knowledge of rural terrain gave him the advantage. The focus shifted to identifying his allies, family members and contacts, who could provide cars and fuel. As 1934 began, Clyde's behavior escalated. The robberies became fewer, but more violent. Each encounter with officers ended in gunfire. Bonnie, still recovering from her injuries, no longer moved easily, but stayed with Clyde, complicating both their emotional and tactical choices. By early 1934, the Bureau had established permanent coordination offices in Dallas and New Orleans. Agents exchanged information, and a plan for federal-state cooperation took shape. The arrest, or death, of Bonnie and Clyde would likely occur in Texas or Louisiana, where their journey had started. Having lost their companions and burned nearly every refuge, the fugitives turned back toward familiar ground. Their movement intersected with the Methven family, setting the stage for the final act. For the Bureau, every piece of evidence gathered pointed to Louisiana, where the chase would inevitably end. In January 1934, law enforcement, already strained by months of failed traps, faced a turning point. On January 16th, Clyde and Bonnie approached the Eastham State Prison farm with the intention of pulling men out by force. The escape was carefully planned, with concealed weapons enabling multiple inmates to run free. 2 guards were killed in the process. This wasn't just a jailbreak, it was a tactical assault, showing the Barrows were no longer just robbers, but willing to attack an institution directly. The shock spread quickly through Texas, signaling that the fugitives had escalated their violence. Among the prisoners freed during the Eastham break was Henry Methven, whose connection to Louisiana brought the fugitives closer to a network that could provide shelter and aid. His escape brought the focus of the manhunt to Louisiana, as fugitives often returned to familiar places for support. The pursuit became less about chasing and more about watching key people and places that could provide temporary refuge for the Barrow Gang. Texas's response shifted from anger to action. Local, state, and federal agencies began to coordinate more urgently. While the Bureau had entered through the stolen car charge, the killing of guards escalated the case. Major routes were patrolled more heavily, but Clyde's knowledge of backroads kept him ahead. The hunt expanded to surveillance, intelligence gathering, and questioning families. Each stolen car crossing state lines added to the growing case. For Bonnie and Clyde, life became even more dangerous. The Eastham attack meant law enforcement would no longer approach them casually. With Henry Methven now part of their group, the risks multiplied. A third man could provide backup but also introduce new vulnerabilities. Stolen cars remained crucial for their survival, but each theft left a new trail for law enforcement to follow, giving them hours of mobility, but also increasing their exposure. In the weeks following Eastham, the most damaging moments for Bonnie and Clyde were not the robberies, but encounters with law enforcement that ended in killings. On April 1st, 1934, near Grapevine, Texas, 2 highway patrolmen were shot before they could defend themselves. The execution-style killings highlighted how quickly a roadside encounter could turn deadly. Public fury and political pressure for more aggressive pursuit grew, turning the chase into a national obsession. In April 1934, the violence escalated when a constable in Miami, Oklahoma, was mortally wounded. The gang's kidnappings became more violent, used as tactical moves to delay pursuit by moving victims into another county. Their mobility wasn't just mechanical, it was strategic, using rural terrain and slow information exchange as weapons. While the violence mounted, the Bureau continued its less dramatic but decisive work. Agents focused on Louisiana, where patterns had begun to repeat. They distributed wanted notices and tracked stolen cars that crossed state lines, building a chronology of Bonnie and Clyde's movements. The case became more structured, with agents following leads and linking dates and places. As the Bureau's focus tightened, Henry Methven and his family came into sharper view. Methven's ties to Louisiana provided the fugitives with shelter and information. A car stolen in New Orleans suggested movement through a city where stolen vehicles could be swapped, and the fugitives' increasing confidence in Louisiana made them more predictable. On April 13, 1934, an FBI agent obtained information that placed Bonnie and Clyde near the Methven home. This intelligence turned the manhunt from a chaotic pursuit into a focused plan. Instead of chasing across states, law enforcement could concentrate on a region where the fugitives had family contacts. The net tightened with coordination and surveillance. As the spring wore on, the pressure increased for both law enforcement and the fugitives. Law enforcement faced false leads and informants who didn't deliver. For the Barrows, Bonnie's injuries and the increasing aggression of law enforcement made each move harder. Their reliance on familiar contacts, like the Methvens and rural Louisiana, grew. But each return increased their risk. The coordination between Louisiana and Texas authorities intensified. They compared notes on the Methven family and prepared for the possibility of another encounter. Intelligence suggested that Bonnie and Clyde, with some of the Methvens, would return to Black Lake, Louisiana, around May 23, 1934. This provided law enforcement with a predicted window to set an ambush. As the ambush approached, final preparations were made. The stretch of road was chosen, positions arranged, and officers briefed on timing and danger. The routine of earlier pursuits was gone. The hunt had evolved into a final plan, based on intelligence. Bonnie and Clyde, still relying on their usual strategy of stolen cars and rapid movement, would face a well-coordinated trap. By May 21st, 1934, the chase had narrowed to a small part of northern Louisiana, where family ties and familiar roads mattered more than speed. Intelligence placed Bonnie and Clyde in the Black Lake area, with members of the Methvin family, revealing that the fugitives were returning to known places and relying on familiar contacts. For months, the pursuit had been a race between movement and information. But now the balance shifted to information. Officers prepared an ambush, focusing on timing, concealment, and minimizing escape routes. Officers involved in the ambush had personal stakes in the hunt, with many having studied the Barrow Gang's violent history. The killings of patrolmen and guards had reshaped law enforcement tactics. Any attempt to approach Bonnie and Clyde directly now carried the expectation of violence. The ambush was planned with precision, choosing a rural road where the fugitives had limited options to escape, making it a tactical operation rather than a simple arrest. In the days leading up to the ambush, officers meticulously planned their positions, aware that any mistake could lead to another escape, or worse. The larger law enforcement network maintained surveillance elsewhere to avoid spooking the fugitives. The fugitives' reliance on familiar routes, stolen cars, and family contacts narrowed their movements, making them more predictable. The Bureau's work turned their routines into a narrow corridor that could be watched and tracked. Before dawn on May 23, 1934, officers concealed themselves along a quiet highway near Sales in Bienville Parish, Louisiana. The wait was tense, as every officer knew the next moment could either lead to a confrontation or require repeating the plan elsewhere. The pressure was intense, but the waiting was disciplined. Everyone understood the stakes: capture or death for the fugitives, and for law enforcement, the end of the chase. As daylight broke, the car appeared as expected. The officers opened fire immediately, overwhelming the fugitives. In that instant, the manhunt ended not with a prolonged chase, but with concentrated force. Bonnie and Clyde were killed in the ambush, and their Ford, the vehicle that had carried them for so long, was left in ruins. The violence of the ambush contrasted with the years of pursuit, a culmination of stolen cars, robberies, and deadly encounters. The aftermath was swift. The killing of Bonnie and Clyde became a national spectacle. News spread quickly, and crowds gathered around the bullet-riddled Ford. The car became both evidence and artifact, representing the couple's method of survival and their method of death. For law enforcement, the ambush marked the end of the chase and the violent conclusion of a long pursuit, ensuring there would be no further escapes or roadside murders of officers. In official summaries and public accounts, the crimes attributed to Bonnie and Clyde solidified into numbers: 13 murders, numerous robberies, and burglaries. Clyde was suspected of killing 2 police officers in Joplin, Missouri. The couple had been linked to kidnappings, including a man and woman in Louisiana, later released near Waldo, Texas. Reports connected them to bank robberies, car thefts, and killings. Some attributions were supported by evidence, while others were based on patterns and rumors. What remained clear was their spree was marked by car thefts, frequent robberies, and a willingness to kill officers rather than be captured. The Bureau's involvement in the chase remained rooted in federal jurisdiction over stolen vehicles. The case began federalizing when stolen cars crossed state lines, leading to the Barrow Circle. Evidence, like the abandoned Ford and the prescription bottle, traced back to Texas, led to a federal warrant in May 1933. Federal agents followed leads across states, distributed wanted notices, and focused on Louisiana as the Methvin connection emerged. The Bureau's role in the pursuit was to provide intelligence and coordination, with local knowledge and state force ultimately closing the trap. Bonnie and Clyde's deaths transformed their story. Once fleeting targets, they became fixed images in public memory, with their violent end in an ambush solidifying their legend. The press replayed their photographs and crimes as symbols of an era when desperation, mobility, and firearms turned local crime into a national spectacle. For law enforcement, it marked the end of a case that had consumed resources and required interjurisdictional cooperation. For the public, it was the final scene of a story that had captivated headlines since 1933. For historians, it marked the point where evidence and jurisdiction converged, ending the flight of 2 who believed movement could outrun consequence. The morning after the ambush, the story had already escaped the officers' control. The Ford sedan became a symbol: justice for some, tragedy for others, and fascination for nearly everyone who had followed the hunt. Crowds gathered, trying to see through bullet holes and shattered windows. Reporters photographed the wreckage. For law enforcement, it marked the end of the pursuit. For the public, it began transforming Bonnie and Clyde into figures of American folklore. At the local courthouse, the bodies of Bonnie and Clyde were examined and identified. Official documentation listed their cause of death as homicide by law enforcement. The photographs that circulated were stark, yet consumed by a public eager for closure. In Dallas, funeral arrangements drew thousands, with Bonnie and Clyde symbolizing defiance and recklessness in an era of poverty and instability. For the Bureau of Investigation, the conclusion was procedural. Reports were filed, evidence cataloged, and the sequence of events reconstructed. The federal charge had been based on stolen cars, but the Bureau's efforts were instrumental in locating the fugitives. The case's closure reinforced the importance of federal-state cooperation, laying the groundwork for the FBI's future evolution. The officers involved in the ambush became minor figures, with Frank Hamer emerging as the most visible. Portrayed as the decisive tactician, Hamer knew the ambush would be controversial but effective, as previous attempts to capture the fugitives alive had ended in gunfire. In Texas and Louisiana, the ambush's effects rippled beyond the immediate aftermath. Families who had sheltered the fugitives faced scrutiny, with the Methvin family caught between law enforcement and public suspicion. The debate over the killings as either a necessary conclusion or an execution without due process reflected the tension between law and spectacle. The Bureau compiled a final report detailing the case, vehicle thefts, gunfights, kidnappings, and the ambush. The report was clinical, but highlighted the scale of the pursuit, the number of states involved, the coordination across jurisdictions, and the total manpower made it one of the largest manhunts in American history. As the public turned from news to myth, Bonnie and Clyde became symbols. Songs, ballads, and pulp stories portrayed them as lovers or hardened criminals. The myth, shaped by their photos and the era's appetite for defiance, expanded their legacy, with their story fitting into the narrative of the Great Depression's disillusionment with authority. In Dallas, Bonnie's funeral was modest, with her mother refusing to bury her beside Clyde. Clyde's burial, attended by former accomplices and admirers, drew large crowds. Visitors chipped fragments of the tombstones as souvenirs, reflecting the blurred line between admiration for defiance and condemnation of crime. The Bureau used the case as a benchmark for training and reform. The pursuit had shown that modern crime required coordination across state lines. The tools of the chase, automobiles, telephones, automatic weapons, had changed the nature of law enforcement, and the Barrow pursuit helped lay the foundation for the FBI's future transformation. The surviving artifacts of the chase became relics of an outlaw mythology. The bullet-riddled Ford toured the country, while personal items from the car were sold or displayed in museums. These remnants provided tangible evidence for historians, but also contributed to the myth that continued to grow. In retrospect, the ambush at Sale symbolized the clash between professional law enforcement and the romanticism of the American outlaw. Bonnie and Clyde were the last of a type of criminal that thrived on speed and chance. As communication systems improved, the conditions that allowed them to vanish disappeared, replaced by a system designed to prevent such long pursuits. For later historians, the moral clarity of the ambush was contested. Some saw it as the necessary end to violence, while others viewed it as a failure of justice. Yet history retained the details. Two young Texans, who became the focus of the largest manhunt in American history, a bureau that gained authority through their pursuit, and a road in Louisiana, where it ended in a storm of gunfire. By the end of the Depression, Bonnie and Clyde had become symbols of rebellion, futility, and the consequences of violence. The Ford they died in rusted into legend, the officers faded into obscurity, and the files documenting the chase became archival paper. While the myth of Bonnie and Clyde endured, their story marked the end of an era, when speed and defiance could only take them as far as the next bend in a lonely Louisiana highway. The road outside Sales quickly became a spectacle. After the ambush, the Ford sedan, now stopped forever, drew crowds, eager to see the vehicle that had carried Bonnie and Clyde. The torn metal and shattered glass absorbed attention, and for the public, it became proof that the chase had ended. For law enforcement, it was a final, tangible end to months of pursuit. But for the public, it turned the fugitives into enduring figures of folklore. Officers managed the scene, securing bodies, weapons, and evidence, while dealing with the inevitability of spectacle. The Ford contained firearms, ammunition, and documents that confirmed identities and provided a final record of their movement. Despite the crowd's attempts to take souvenirs, law enforcement treated the car as evidence. The chase had become a public drama, and the scene was treated like a public event. The car's movement did not diminish public interest. It only increased it. Once the Ford reached populated areas, it drew larger crowds, as people lined up to see a piece of national news. The public had followed stories of outlaws crossing state lines, and now the car brought the manhunt into sharper focus, making the violence tangible. The Ford removed the distance between the public and the violence, making the ending appear final. While crowds gathered, law enforcement worked through procedural demands. Bonnie and Clyde's identities were confirmed through photographs and wanted notices. The bodies, weapons, and items from the car were logged, and a final report was prepared. The case that had started with stolen cars now ended with the most conclusive evidence possible: the bodies and vehicle of the fugitives. The return of the bodies to Texas triggered public reaction. For Bonnie's family, grief was mixed with notoriety. The death arrived with crowds, cameras, and an appetite for detail. Clyde's family had lived under surveillance and suspicion for months. Now the public insisted on witnessing every stage of the aftermath, with funerals drawing extraordinary numbers of spectators. The behavior of the crowds revealed the era's tension between condemnation and fascination. Bonnie and Clyde were criminals, yet their youth, attractiveness, and fearlessness in a time of powerlessness shaped public perception. Some saw them as murderers, others viewed them as tragic figures. This instability in public opinion intensified the aftermath, with conflicting interpretations of the same events. For the Bureau, the end of the chase was both closure and opportunity. The case demonstrated the value of centralized record-keeping, the importance of distributing fingerprints and photographs, and the necessity of jurisdictional clarity. Federal agents had tracked small pieces of evidence across state lines, turning scattered incidents into a coordinated pursuit. The case showed the need for national coordination in an era of mobile criminals. The case also exposed the limits of federal authority at the time. The Bureau's jurisdiction began with stolen cars crossing state lines, not the couple's crimes. This narrow entry point highlighted how many violent crimes remained local, even when their impact was national. The public pressure from the chase led to calls for stronger federal tools, as criminals exploited state lines as legal barriers. After the Louisiana ambush, the Bureau moved quickly to finalize reports and circulate official accounts. The case that had consumed years of pursuit ended with a combination of interstate coordination, forensic record-keeping, and tactical field operations. For the first time, the federal government had the ability to end a national manhunt without relying on local authorities. This success proved the Bureau's operational capabilities. J. Edgar Hoover, though not directly involved in the chase, had shaped the Bureau's methods. He emphasized control and image, ensuring the Bureau's professionalism. The Bureau's success with the Barrow case demonstrated the need for disciplined, trained agents, rather than rough-edged detectives. Hoover understood the cultural impact, promoting the Bureau's image as a symbol of order. The public's view shifted as newspapers that once glamorized outlaws now praised the Bureau's efficiency. Hoover understood the power of public perception, and he ordered agents to maintain polished appearances and controlled language. The Bureau became both an authority and a brand, with its image built on professionalism. The transformation of the Bureau paralleled a shift in crime itself. As the economy recovered, criminals like Bonnie and Clyde gave way to organized crime syndicates. The Bureau's new focus was on smuggling, racketeering, and political corruption. As the era of isolated highway robbers ended, Hoover pushed for institutional expansion, and within a year, the Bureau of Investigation was renamed the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Congress granted the FBI broader powers, turning interstate crime into a federal offense. This expansion was a direct result of the lessons learned from Bonnie and Clyde's chase, which exposed the fragmented nature of law enforcement. The Bureau's training programs reflected its new ethos. Agents studied forensic techniques, case files from the Barrow investigation, and tactical lessons from the Louisiana ambush. The focus was on systematic, impersonal, and relentless investigative work, turning the chase into a model for modern policing. The American landscape also shifted towards structure. The chaotic, Depression-era criminal world gave way to a more organized system. Federal prisons expanded, parole systems grew stricter, and communication networks connected jurisdictions. By the end of the decade, the rural bandit archetype was replaced by the urban gangster, constrained by federal reach. The Bureau's rise reshaped public psychology. Hoover presented his agents as the nation's shield against internal threats, like crime and corruption. The Bureau's competence and moral purity were emphasized, and trust in Washington grew. Though it required constant narrative maintenance, centralized power brought stability but also potential danger. Hoover instinctively understood that each successful operation fed into the Bureau's mythology. High-profile captures, like John Dillinger and Bonnie and Clyde's deaths, became chapters in a national victory over lawlessness. The Bureau's image evolved from chasing criminals to defining the conditions under which criminals could exist, blurring the line between justice and spectacle. In cities, law enforcement modernized, adopting FBI practices like fingerprinting, photographic records, and centralized radio systems. State academies trained recruits using FBI manuals. The Bureau's influence spread through imitation, with Hoover's focus on discipline and documentation transforming police work. The image of the professional investigator replaced the armed sheriff, signaling the closing of the frontier. Culturally, The outlaw symbol of resistance gave way to the agent, symbolizing order. Films and media shifted from stories of desperate lovers on the run to tales of lawmen restoring stability. This shift reflected the country's need for structure and heroes who represented order rather than defiance. Hoover's control over the Bureau led to rigidity. Mistakes were career-ending, and dissent was seen as disloyalty. However, the discipline ensured predictability, allowing the Bureau to process criminals through a system rather than chasing them through confusion. The Bonnie and Clyde ambush set a precedent. Lethal force, executed with planning, was accepted as justice. State police staged raids, and armed confrontations were justified by precedent. The Ford's bullet-riddled body became part of the cultural vocabulary, equating overwhelming force with closure. Hoover expanded the Bureau's influence through annual reports that demonstrated efficiency. The Bureau's forensic labs, fingerprint archives, and training academies expanded, and Congress increased funding. A feedback loop formed. Success bred funding, which led to more expansion. The Bureau became a self-sustaining bureaucracy. The old outlaw world withered. Small-town robbers who tried to imitate Bonnie and Clyde's methods were quickly intercepted. The speed of communication and interstate cooperation erased the advantage that mobility once gave criminals. The rural bandit era ended as federal trials and prison sentences took over. As public life became more regulated, the fascination with rebellion shifted into art. The state had won the practical battle, but imagination remained restless. The attraction to defiance, seen in the memory of Depression-era outlaws, continued to feed popular culture for generations. The Bureau's success influenced the development of other agencies. Intelligence gathering and cross-state authority became the hallmarks of modern governance. The federal center expanded its reach, and citizens began measuring safety by institutional presence rather than proximity to neighbors. By 1939, Hoover's FBI had become a symbol of discipline. The Bonnie and Clyde case became a foundational lesson, representing the transition from chaotic pursuit to controlled execution. The agents who joined the Bureau in 1939 carried the memory of how chaos had been conquered. The nation shifted from producing fugitives to producing administrators. The gunfire that ended Bonnie and Clyde's lives became a lesson in control, showing that force alone wasn't enough. Narrative had to accompany it. The myth of the outlaw gave way to the myth of the agent. By the late 1930s, the FBI was central to American identity. Hoover's agents became archetypes of order, and the Bureau replaced the posse. The Louisiana ambush marked the end of an era, with the road no longer a place to disappear, but a corridor of surveillance leading back to the state. In the years after the ambush, the violence of May 23, 1934, faded from immediate memory, replaced by a simplified legend. The bodies were buried, and the chase was closed, but the image of a young man and woman in a car, guns in hand, remained. This simplified version of events could be retold in many forms, and became immortal because it was easy to understand. Two ran. The state hunted, and the state won. The worst parts of the Bonnie and Clyde story remained unavoidable, as the violence was too explicit. Their killings of officers continued to be central in law enforcement memory, creating a parallel narrative that focused on escalating danger rather than defiance. This official version formed from the crimes attributed to them, the kidnappings, and the final ambush, coexisted with the public myth. Some viewed them as folk criminals, others as murderers whose fame insulted the dead. This tension kept the story alive, as debates over what they represented forced people to revisit the events. In communities directly affected by the gang, the memory was more factual. The people robbed or abducted did not romanticize the story. They remembered fear, compliance, and survival. The families of fallen officers carried grief, not legend. This localized memory countered the broader myth, forcing retellings to include the personal cost to those who hadn't asked to be part of the narrative. The story's structure, chase, pursuit, escape, final trap, became a cultural template for modern fugitives. The Bonnie and Clyde manhunt had all the elements of a national thriller, making it adaptable for dramatization. The ambush gave the story a satisfying ending, emotionally impactful and easier to remember. The final truth remains simple. Bonnie and Clyde became fugitives, and the country hunted them. Their escape was not the end of their story. Their predictability led to their downfall. The gunfire on May 23, 1934, ended the chase, but its meaning continued to shift, and the legend grew, adding complexity to the story that started with simple facts. In rural Louisiana, a stretch of highway still carries the weight of that moment when America watched two lives end and spent decades debating what they represented. Like, share, and subscribe to stay with the mystery crime for new cases.